Welcome to the Outthinkers Podcast. Plug into fascinating minds and breakthrough ideas that are transforming industries and the world. I'm your host, Kyan Krippendorf, founder of Outthinker Networks, a global think tank comprised of corporate strategists, innovators, and entrepreneurs that are shaping the future of business. If this describes you, join us at outthinker.com. Now, let's dive into this week's episode.
So Daniel Susskind has written in Growth about the growth dilemma. He does quite a lot of really interesting history of how we got to the point where growth was even an objective economically. Until the Industrial Revolution, economies didn't really grow at all. You were sort of born, you tilled the fields, or you did whatever you'd been born into for a relatively short time, less than 50 years, probably an average longevity, and then you died, and that was it. Nothing moved forward. And then the Industrial Revolution gave a huge jolt to global economies, and growth took off and gradually became the objective for a lot of economies, to the point where they were comparing each other's growth rates, became a mark of pride to be the fastest growing, etc. Of course, it's become clear that that pursuit of growth has consequences, particularly on the planet, also in terms of inequality. And this is the dilemma. How do you balance growth, which we recognize to be a very useful way of bringing people out of poverty and into prosperity, with the potential harms that growth can create?
That was Andrew Hill, senior business writer at the Financial Times and consulting editor of FT Live. He's the author of Ruskinland, about the enduring influence of Victorian thinker John Ruskin, and Leadership in the Headlines, a collection of Andrew's columns. We were quite lucky to be able to corral Andrew to have a conversation with us, and I'd be remiss not to preface that this podcast is a little bit different than our typical format. Instead of diving into one author's ideas or one framework or thinking around one business trend, in this episode, we get a chance to glean insights from multiple books from his experience curating the best business books of the year for the Financial Times. In the highlighted clip, you heard one of several thought-provoking ideas we explore as we journey through this year's FT and Schroders Business Book of the Year, 2024. We get an inside look into the year's roundup, why they were chosen, and what it says about the current state of business. We also get to explore how the best business book lists has evolved over the years and what it means for the present and future of business. Andrew's long tenure made for an interesting conversation into more niche topics, leading even to what John Ruskin, the Victorian polymath from the 1800s, would have thought of particular trends highlighted in this collection of books in the modern era. In this podcast, we hope you enjoy hearing us discuss whether the purpose of the corporation has changed. Should we move beyond being profit-driven? Whether the relentless pursuit of economic growth is sustainable or even desirable given environmental and social constraints? Could tribalism, which is often seen as divisive, be a force for collaboration and innovation and unity? Why the increase in human longevity may mean that we need to rethink life stages and adopt a multi-stage life model where we blend career, education, and leisure throughout a lifetime. Andrew's own journey at the Financial Times, and how the best business books list was established and has evolved over time. Ladies and gentlemen, Andrew Hill. Andrew, thank you so much for being here with us. I know, especially now, you're very busy, and appreciate you taking some time to talk to us.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So for me, this is a real treat because I get to talk to someone who looks at lots and lots of business books and concepts. And so we can cover more than one, but kind of the constellation. I do want to start with the same two questions that I ask all of our guests. The first one, just for us to get to know you a little bit more personally, could you complete the sentence for me? If you really know me, you know that.
You know that I have a strange interest in eccentric Victorian thinkers and innovators. Well, I wrote a book 5 years ago about John Ruskin, the Victorian art critic turned social critic, painter, artist, geologist, scientist, proto-environmentalist, and all the facets of his thinking, which is still relevant today. So he's probably the first I'd come to. But I've also started getting interested in some of the other innovators in obscure areas such as pen shorthand, something I'm looking at.
Oh, yes. I know. Yeah. You're working on what's happening to shorthand. We'll come back to that. But I do think I don't want to say comical, but it's fascinating that during the Victorian era especially, but in general, like, you were a scientist and doctor and artist, and, you were allowed to have many of these professions or areas of interest and expertise. And we seem to be much more specialized now than was encouraged before.
Yeah, people are a bit suspicious now of polymaths. John Ruskin was definitely a polymath. People now think that's just weirdly generalizing, and how could you be really good at all those things? But he actually was.
Yeah, remarkable. This is a podcast about strategy, and so my next question is, what's your definition of strategy?
Well, I kind of refer back to Richard Rummelt, who is UCLA strategy professor, and his definition, which I've used a number of times, is diagnose critical challenges, set a guiding policy to deal with them, and then take coherent action to accomplish your goals. And the thing I really like about his definition is that last bit, that he explicitly says strategy is not just the vision. You have to have a vision and a goal, but you've got to set the actions that are going to take you in that direction, even if the goal is way off. And he uses the example of the moonshot, the literal moonshot of the US trying to land on the moon, and how that was set as this great vision by JFK and then became a reality because he already knew from the information he'd got from scientists at NASA and elsewhere that it was possible. It was a stretch goal, but it was possible. So I like that combination really of vision and action that he lays out.
Love that. Yeah, he was on this podcast early on and highly influential. Strategy is what you do, not what you say you're going to do. Vision without action is a daydream, and action without vision is a nightmare. The marrying of those two. Excellent. So we want to talk about the Financial Times Business Book of the Year awards and talk a little bit about those books and what you're seeing in the photo shot of what those books are today and what they've been in the past. But just, if you don't mind, just tell us a little bit of your history about how you came to become the editor of the book awards.
Yeah, sure. Well, we launched the book awards in 2005. They're an annual award, so this year is has been the 20th edition. And the aim of the awards remains the same, really, which is the same, if you like, as the aim of the Financial Times itself, that we are editing the news, we're filtering the news, so busy people read what they need to read. And we applied that to business books, something like 10,000 business books published every year. And so we're filtering and distilling and narrowing down those books every year to yield 15 or 16 for a long list, 6 for a short list, and ultimately the winner. And I came to be involved more or less because I was in the right place at the right time. When the editor of the Times said we ought to do a book award, I was our opinion editor, and it fell to me to launch it, and I've stuck with it ever since.
Great. And what is the criteria or the process by which you narrow them down? I know that, I understand that, kind of the objective is, if you're a busy person, these are the books that you should read, as opposed to this is the most creative book or this is the most well-written book, but it's really about the content. So just tell us a little bit about the philosophy.
Yeah, I mean, the key philosophy, and it's very simple, really, from the start has been that we're picking, or our judges are picking, the most compelling and enjoyable book of the year. So compelling is pretty easy to understand, but compelling might yield you a lot of very weighty and rather dull, worthy contenders. Enjoyable gives you an additional kind of twist that says, there's nothing wrong if you stop halfway through. That probably means it's not the most enjoyable book on this list. And you can argue with the choices that we've made over the years, but that has really helped us refine things. And the only real change to the criteria since the beginning is that we added another slightly contentious element, that the books chosen ought to stand the test of time, which of course in the moment you can't really tell. But I think actually our winners certainly have stood up pretty well. And the process, well, obviously there are a lot of books out there. We We try to use a sort of radar, if you like, to spot books before they're published, ones that are creating buzz, ones that are, written by notable people, ones that seem quirky or interesting. And the breadth of the books we look at is pretty wide, because we're not just looking at traditional business and management books. We're also looking at books that are biographies, histories. We've even had a couple of novels contending. They're not excluded. And we start with the radar. We then invite entries. We encourage publishers to enter books that we might have spotted that they might not think are contenders. And we usually end up with around 600 entries, which I coordinate a team of hardworking colleagues to filter that first 600. They then bring it down to, let's say, about 100. At that point, it starts to get really tricky. And again, I use my colleagues' expertise to try and analyze the books that have been entered and have reached that stage. And ultimately, it's a small group of us arguing about what should be the 15 or 16 on the list. And those in the long list are the books that are put to our senior judges, a panel of 10, led by the editor of the FT, who narrow it down to a short list and ultimately a winner. The long list is 15 or 16. And obviously, you don't want your 15 or 16 all to be books for the sake of argument about technology or about economics. So there is a certain amount of kind of getting the mix right in there, but it's very much an apples and oranges process, which we agonize over for some months.
Sure. Yeah. That's the humans still matter in the process of filtering useful information. And
that pleases me even when we are confronted with 600 PDFs of unpublished books that we need to go through.
No, I love it. It's very balanced list, and not just the bestsellers, but actually you can discover pieces of work that you might not otherwise find. I do see interesting commonalities between the books on the short list this year, and I know that you've chosen the book of the year already, but and topics that are coming up as of interest to strategy officers and innovation officers. So I wanted to maybe just touch on each of the books very lightly, just to talk about what they say about what matters today. But before I do that, maybe just like from a bird's eye view, if you compare the submissions that you've gotten and the list that you ended up with in 2024 with prior years, what are you seeing as that could indicate what the zeitgeist or interest or challenges are, how they're changing?
Well, obviously, publishing is a lagging indicator, because books take a while. Even if you push something through rapidly, it takes a while. But over the years, I think probably the winners that we've chosen have shown trends. The first book selected to be Book of the Year was Tom Friedman's The World is Flat, his great kind of paean to globalization. That was obviously a time when everyone was looking globally, and globalization was the big theme. Then we went through the financial crisis and had a lot of financial books. And now we're moving into, or have moved into in the last 4 or 5 years, if not earlier, into technology. And these are books that to some degree have dominated the winner's podium, but also the entries. I mean, there've been a lot of books over that time that have examined, starting with Martin Ford's Rise of the Robots, which won when it came out, through to this year when we had a number of AI books on the list. So technology, I think, has been the leading thing. One thing I noticed over the years, though, was that as the technology books came in, you also had a sort of similar, sort of parallel list of books with human in the title. You had this interesting back and forth, if you like, between the books that were techno-optimist for the machine versus those that recognized, as I do, I think, that probably as the machine rises, you also get a greater understanding of where the human is important, both in the kind of setting of strategy, the running of companies, the development of everything that companies and organizations might be doing. So that has been something that maybe I'm looking out for that because I'm interested in that aspect. I think it's also true the last few years, and not specifically on this year's shortlist, but we have had a lot more books about the commodities, the minerals, the actual substance of capitalism, what goes into things. Chip War by Chris Miller won a couple of years ago. And that's as much a book about semiconductors and US-China rivalry and so on. But it's also a book about how do we make the things that go into the devices on which we depend. And we've had a number of books that have looked at that area, which I don't remember being a feature of the early years of the prize when we were looking at the entries.
Yeah, it makes sense. I think the rapid emergence of new types of products that require very specific inputs, probably suddenly there's like surges of demands of these inputs that create this new races to controlling the diamond mines, if so to speak.
Yeah, and I think from an author point of view, the other thing is that, we're living in a virtual world. One of the books on the shortlist this year, The Corporation in the 21st Century by John Kay, is essentially about how the company has been changed and company strategy has been changed by the development of more digital services. But that has, I think, that digitalization has fueled an interest among authors in, what are the actual things that we have to still dig out of the ground or distill from the air around us or make into to make into things. An interest in the substance of capitalism and manufacturing in a world when a lot of what is we buy and sell and do is essentially insubstantial and intangible.
Yeah, I guess maybe it's more surprising. We're receiving value digitally, but we don't think about that that's being created by physical things. Interesting. Maybe we could just touch first on that one, The Corporation in the 21st Century, John Kay. What was it about that book that you felt warranted it to be one on the short list?
Sure. Well, I mean, first of all, it's certainly enjoyable. He's a very good writer. More than 5 years ago, he used to actually write a column for the Financial Times. So I recognize and know his writing well. But it's a book that is essentially, as he writes, a book for people who need to understand about business. And so in that sense, maybe not a book for those who are actually well versed in the way business works, but he is very waspish about business, where it goes wrong, where he thinks it's gone down a narrow path towards, for example, his pursuit of shareholder value. He's very critical of that. And he points out a number of examples about the scandals and problems that arise from not looking at the kind of wider picture for business. It's supposed to be the first of a trilogy, and I think later books will, I hope, pick up this theme and apply it to where companies are going, not just where they've come from. So it's very much a book for those who need to know about what is this thing, the company, the corporation, where did it come from? What is it still adapted to the world we live in? And his essential conclusion is, well, it needs to adapt faster because it's becoming difficult to see that as the main vehicle for modern capitalism.
Interesting. Yeah. There's so many themes to pull apart there. The changing of economics and the theory of the firm and the rethinking of how organizations are structured, the externalities becoming internalities, making profit arguments for doing good. And then this kind of unsustainability of the short-termism versus the long-termism. What's your sense of, I can see forces pushing us towards, I really believe in, personally as a human, that if corporations take a long-term perspective, then all these externalities become internalities, and doing what's profitable aligns very closely with what doing good. And so I really want to believe that. And yet there is also this sort of counter pressure right now against ESG and it seems to sort of be a little bit of a battle. What's your sense of where we are right now in this moment?
Well, I'm a strong believer in the long-termist view is the right view. I think you don't need to go very far down the road of thinking, well, if we agree that certain things we're doing are destroying the planet, destroyed planet is not going to be a brilliant place in which to sell our future products. But of course, that can devolve into an argument about how quickly that's going to happen. There are counter arguments about technology and how it might help us to overcome those kind of constraints. We'll doubtless come to another book on the list, Growth, which looks at that very dilemma by Daniel Susskind. I think the issue that has made this a difficult moment for that argument is that ESG was specifically I wouldn't say hijacked, but it was certainly became captured by a world of investment and a sort of faddish movement that not everyone was able to deliver on. So companies overpromised on some of the things they were doing. Some of them may even have explicitly, or sort of may, sorry, I'll start on that bit again. Some of them may even have said, I'm going to put an ESG label on here, but I don't actually have to do any of it. And that bred cynicism, which led to a backlash, which led to accusations of wokeism taking over the world. And that became melded, particularly in the US, with a pushback against diversity, equality, and inclusion, which fits under, obviously, the S of ESG. And that's created a mess, I think, where ESG is not helping as an acronym. And I don't think in the States, certainly, that it gets used much at all now. I hope that the underlying logic of looking to the long term and behaving more sustainably as a company is sustained beyond this, I hope, temporary backlash. I think it would be dangerous if that weren't the case.
Yeah, it's interesting to see what the other names are that take hold and that movement can adopt a new name, and it's almost sort of a battle of language.
Yeah, people in that area do get a bit obsessed with the naming. I mean, we went through corporate social responsibility, sustainability, ESG, but I think certainly the E of ESG is so pressing for so many people and therefore for so many companies that actually we can go beyond the naming now and say, look, there's a real and present danger here that if something isn't done, either technologically or in terms of reassessing what the goals are of particular companies, that we're going to be plunged into even greater jeopardy. And that will be bad for everybody.
And the second book on your list sort of offers another tool, I guess, to move us towards that tribal, how the cultural instincts that divide us can help bring us together. Michael Morris, sort of as I honestly have not read the book, but read about the book. You know, it sort of argues that humans are naturally collaborative creatures. That's how we survived in tribes. And so looking out for each other is a natural evolutionary habit. Just, do you mind just telling us a little bit about that book and why you chose?
Sure. I mean, this is obviously one that falls into a category that sort of emerged over the 20 years of the prize to be pretty dominant at one point of kind of behavioral science, anthropology, psychology. This book is reclaiming tribalism for those optimists among us who think that people ought to get on together, and pointing out that actually a lot of the great things that have happened in the world are or to human beings, a lot of the great things that have happened to you human beings are actually a product of teamwork, for want of a better word, for tribes working together to develop and improve the worlds they live in. So as you say, it's a sort of counterpoint or at least a complement to the discussion of what happens with our environment. And I think an optimistic book, a very timely book, deliberately timed, I think, to offset the idea that tribes are bad and tribalism will always lead to the lowest common denominator and a race to the bottom. Michael Morris, the author, makes a more positive point that if you can harness those positive aspects, you can actually improve the world. And he takes that across a whole range of examples, from companies to governments. And one that stuck with me, even though it's a very micro thing, was why do we want to be some of the time, at least, in offices with other people? It's because actually picking up signals and being able to work together as teams is something that humans do naturally, and it doesn't come easy to us if we're stuck remotely, however good the technology is that can link us together. So I think a very timely book, really interesting. Lots of members of the judging panel said this was one that they wish they'd had when they were CEOs or running teams, to be able to help them to shape the way in which that tribal instinct works for the good.
Fascinating. I recently had someone on the podcast that was sort of about tribalism around brands, and now I'm been looking at kind of tribalism in organizations as culture. I think it's really can be, as with the technology, a powerful or not as well. Let's talk a little bit about the longevity imperative. I think that's really interesting. Andrew Scott, like the idea is that, people are living much longer and our education systems are the careers, work, leisure time are all kind of like tied to, I don't know, 70-year life or whatever that is. Just tell us a little bit about why you chose that. And what I'm particularly interested in this idea of the multi-stage life. I think people would be interested in that. I know you're not the author of the book, and you read lots of books, but just give us a little flavor of it.
Yeah, so as you say, the thesis of the book is that if we are more of us are likely to live to be 100 years plus, particularly obviously the younger generation, those being born now, stand a greater chance. Then that requires a rethink on the part of everybody, individuals, organizations for which they work, policymakers, institutions everywhere. It requires a rethink of what used to be thought of as a bit of a kind of 70 and done, or 65 and done, if you take a sort of typical European retirement age approach, because you get to 60 and you could have another 30, even 40 years left. So that changes everything. And Andrew Scott was the co-author with Linda Grattan of a book that was on our shortlist a few years ago called The 100-Year Life. And here he's the economist of the duo. Here he picks up both the economic line, but also the social implications of a life that is lived, as you say, more in a sort of in multiple stages, and how that actually changes when you are thinking about how to educate yourself, when to educate yourself. You no longer front-loading education, so it's done up to the age of 20, 25, but finding other ways to re-educate, relearn, reskill. It affects relationships. Obviously, it affects healthcare, because one of his underlying premises is that we may be living longer, but we need to also be living healthier lives. There's no point in having a 30-year life, which is essentially that of an invalid. So the issue of how to achieve that and then what to do to make the most of it is right at the heart of this. He posits something called the Evergreen Agenda, that he calls the Evergreen Agenda, which is the way in which policymakers need to think about how to improve the lives of the longer lived. So I think it's a very imaginative and thought-provoking way of thinking about a problem. Interestingly, I spoke to some Japanese colleagues. The Financial Times belongs to Nikkei, Japanese company, who obviously pointed out that in Japan, a country known for the longevity of its citizens, they've already been going through some of these policy changes and having to address some of these issues in order to avoid being caught with, top-heavy, unwell population. And of course, it's coming to lots of countries now, particularly in the developed world.
Yes, yep. With our birth rates. Yeah, I want to go through all of them, but I know we're reaching kind of the top of our time. But it does seem like I'm really curious about growth, a reckoning, Daniel Susskind. And it seems to me, if we stay with Japan for a moment, right? In Japan, you have these 150-year-old, 250-year-old companies that it seems like a stark contrast from, hey, Silicon Valley, I'm going to hyperscale. And right. So tell us a little bit about the premise of the book and why you chose this as one of the shortlist books.
Yeah, growth. So Daniel Susskind has written in Growth about about the growth dilemma. So first of all, he does quite a lot of really interesting history of how we got to the point where growth was even an objective economically. And he points out that until the Industrial Revolution, economies didn't really grow at all. You were sort of born, you tilled the fields, or you did whatever you'd been born into for a relatively short time, less than 50 years, probably on average longevity. And then you died, and that was it. And nothing moved forward. And then the Industrial Revolution gave a huge jolt to global economies, and growth took off and gradually became the objective for a lot of economies, to the point where they were comparing each other's growth rates, became a mark of pride to be the fastest growing, etc. But as he points out, relatively recently, it's become clear that what looked like an easy bet by governments, we just grow faster, everyone gets richer, they get happier, they re-elect us, and repeat, rinse and repeat. Latterly, of course, it's become clear that pursuit of growth has consequences, particularly on the planet, also in terms of inequality. And this is the dilemma. How do you balance growth, which we recognize to be a very useful way of bringing people out of poverty and into prosperity, with the potential harms that growth can create? And this is what he's addressing, really, both the history and how we got to where we got to, and how we might get out of what looks like an impossible, immovable force, unstoppable force meeting an immovable object. And his answers to that lie both in the ingenuity of humans, technology, some of the things we've already talked about, but also in, as he points out, this is something that really needs to go back to the citizenry needs to decide. It's a political decision, a very important one, how you balance these things. And that can only be decided by the people, because these are tough decisions that no one authority can take on its own. And he's also very critical of, incidentally, the degrowthers, those who would claim that you have to just turn back growth, stop growing as a solution, because otherwise it's going to ruin everything. He says that's actually not a solution. That leaves us with stagnation, poverty, lots of issues that can only be solved by continuing to grow.
Yeah. We've built the system to depend on growth, like a shark needs to keep swimming. All right, so this is fascinating. I mean, each of these you can start seeing they're different topics, but they start rhyming. They sort of build on each other. And we didn't talk about two of the books, Unit X, how the Pentagon and Silicon Valley are changing the future of warfare, which is about the adoption of Silicon Valley technologies and approaches into military and defense, and another technology book, which ultimately won, Supremacy, AI, ChatGPT, and the Race That Will Change the World by Parmi Olson. We don't have time to go through those, but you've got technology, you've got tribalism, you've got short-termism versus long-termism, you've got growth versus alternative to growth. All these different perspectives seem to like pulling together maybe a picture. And I'm wondering, what would John Ruskin, if he were alive today, what would he say about these different perspectives, do you think?
So one thing that Ruskin was very good at was spotting the connections between diverse things. And in lots of respects, his work, his life's work, was making those connections. So spotting, for example, that industrial pollution, which was not something that people were really thinking about, was affecting the weather. I mean, the early spotting of climate change, spotting how human cohabitation with nature was changing the shape of the valleys of Italy and Switzerland, where he used to tour, and connecting together apparently diverse areas, like a polymath does. And this was, to some degree, I talk of him a little bit as a sort of internet before the internet, in that he was able to link these various things. In respect of the arts and crafts movement, his preferred model was small-scale, craft-based, and in the context of the gigantic corporations that were emerging from the Industrial Revolution, that obviously seemed irrelevant. And indeed, a lot of the ventures that he tried to back of that scale failed. But I can see that there is an opportunity created by technology actually to energize smaller scale ventures. And you see that in craft-based organizations like Etsy, for example. They're pulling through creators and giving them opportunities in ways that probably didn't exist for the craft-based organizations that John Ruskin backed or approved of. And so that is a bit of optimism. I think the danger, one which Parmi Olson in Supremacy points out, is that these bright ideas are very quickly swamped or bought out by the bigger organizations. And so the sheer scale of a Google or a DeepMind as part of Google, or OpenAI as it's growing, or indeed XAI, Elon Musk's AI outfit, threatens to just suck in all the potential of those smaller organizations. Even as they're using it, none is able to provide a sort of threat to the big organizations. But those technology platforms and many others do provide an opportunity for people who want to revert to being to have that smaller scale, to collaborate. And here we're in Michael Morris's tribal, to collaborate with others who they might, in previous generations, certainly in Ruskin's generation, never have encountered. There's much more ability to discover the people you're going to collaborate with, to discover your tribe, if you like.
Almost like if you take the positive and negative flip of each of these, if we put the positive flip, it gives you the contours of a really interesting economic form or norm. But as all these books point out, we need to be diligent because the direction in which it evolves is at least partially within our control.
Yes, I think that's right.
But we are at the top of our time with you. I really want to thank you. It's really a gift to get to sit with someone who looks at thousands of books, into 600 books, to 100 books, to 15 books, to 6 books, to 1 book, and get a little bit of a glimpse into the patterns that you see. Thank you for doing that work for us, and thank you for spending some time to give us a little taste of its conclusions.
It's been a great pleasure. Thank you for having me.